Here now for our first lecture in 2024 in our lecture series on political culture. And we are pleased and to have the honor to have Stephen Welch here, giving a talk on political culture, democracy, and crisis. And a few notes on Stephen is he's honorary fellow and former lecturer at the School of Government and International Affairs in Durham University in the UK. And he's the author of several books on the topic of political culture, including a book called The Concept of Political Culture from the 1990s, a book called Just the Theory of Political Culture from the 2013, and he's also the author of an entry in the Sage Handbook of Political Sociology on political culture. And he's currently working on a project on hyperdemocracy in America. And just said that he will go for a fellowship in the US for doing research there. So we are very pleased to have a very, very distinguished expert on the issue of political culture here, giving a lecture in our lecture series on political culture. So, Steve, we are very pleased to have you here, and we are looking forward for your talk. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. I didn't ask in advance how long you wanted me to talk for. I was assuming maybe 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I've got some slides, which I may as well show. Where are they? Just a second while I mess around.
Mm-hmm. Don't worry, don't hurry.
Okay, is that visible?
Yeah.
Let me just put full screen.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Right. Thanks for attending, everyone. As I say, I'll try and talk for about 45 minutes, but if I don't manage that, feel free to interrupt me and remind me. Part of the reason I'm interested in giving this talk, which I was kindly invited to do by the organisers, is, thanks for the invitation, is because a few years ago I wrote two books that came out in the same year, 2013. I don't quite know why I was so busy that year, but anyway, that's the way it worked out. These are they. One was continuing my work on political culture, and the other was called Hyperdemocracy, which was venturing into more general areas of democratic theory. And although they both came out in the same year, they didn't really both say the same thing. And indeed, there is some question about how they actually connect with each other, theoretically, intellectually, and so on. What do they add up to? Which questions I've never really resolved. It's really only a question for me. I'm the only person in the world that's really deeply troubled by this question because, first of all, most other people in the world haven't read either of them. But even those who, by some mischance, have read both, there may not be any such people in that group, but even if they had, it's no problem for them to say, yes, I agree with this, but I don't agree with that. I have the problem of trying to reconcile these two books, which I didn't do fully when I wrote them. And part of what I'm doing now is moving in that direction, trying to work that out. I've been thinking about it for quite a long time. I thought I'd better try formulating it as a talk and maybe subsequently an essay. That's a sort of autobiographical reason to do this. The more general reasons to address this question that's indicated in the title, I think, are fairly obvious from the title itself, insofar as it mentions a crisis. So I want to talk about three phases of political culture research's engagement with democracy, and 3 phases of post-war democracy as well that these phases relate to. First phase, democratic fragility. It's the post-war period, the period after the Second World War, in which probably the most significant looming memory and concern was the collapse of the Weimar Republic, which had instantiated a democracy, a constitutional democracy, which proved to be quite fragile. There was a concern about the fragility of democracy in a number of different writings, but political culture research was one of those areas which engage with this important question, notably in the form of Ullman and Werber's book, The Civic Culture, which I recently reread, having first read it about 40 years ago when I was doing a doctorate on this subject that turned into my first book. And I must say I found it less irritating than I had when I first read it, and it has a number of good features that it very well merits being read again, I think. Anyway, its thesis is, I think, quite well known to everyone here. They spoke about political culture, which they defined in terms of orientations, a very vague word, but they spelled it out a little bit more, not much more, but a bit more clearly by speaking about cognitive, affective, and evaluative orientations. And they conducted some surveys that were meant to elucidate and expose these, and in 5 countries, US, UK, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and found political cultural kind of analogues of democracy, things that went with it. It was much criticized, this book, at the time, in the 1960s, that is, it came out in the early 60s, for being, as they report, as they themselves comment in the preface to this edition of it that I put on screen, it came out in 1980, a reissue, of being accused of being because it was accused of being a defense of apathy. It spoke about something called the civic culture, and a component of the civic culture, particularly according to its critics, was that it balanced, it contained, among other things, more pleasing things to democratic theorists, such as participatory inclinations, also this idea of trusting governments to govern. And this was taken, as I say, to be a defense of apathy. And that's really I think Ullman and Werber in 1980 were correct in saying that was the principal kind of legacy of the book. The suggestion that you don't, for democracy to survive, you don't need so much a whole body of activated citizens. You need a certain number of them, certain amount of the time, but you also need that to be offset by citizens that are more capable of being subjects. There's something in this claim that it was a defense of apathy, although it's also an overstatement, particularly when you consider what they actually said on the heading of what they call subject competence, which wasn't really just behaving yourself, but actually knowing how to engage with bureaucrats and so on. Anyway, the principal conceptual vehicle for this claim was this idea of the civic culture, which they expound at length in the book. And it's actually quite a complex idea, more complex than it's normally made out to be, and more complex than I remembered it being myself from when I first read it. It can be simply described as a balance between participant orientations and subject orientations, but with a certain amount of leftover parochial orientations as well. But how that balance exactly works and what these two bodies of things are is, as I've already said in my remarks on apathy, a bit more complex than is normally understood. I'm not going to fill up the rest of this talk, or much more of it at all, with going through this material, which, however, I do think needs a bit of further revisiting, and I have thought about trying to write something just about this book. partially to correct my earlier critique of it, which I don't entirely disagree with, but I now partially do, but more generally to correct the kind of reputation that it has. Broadly speaking, you have this notion that Britain and the United States have this balanced political culture, with a balance tilting somewhat towards participatory orientations in the United States and somewhat more towards subject ones, or this allegedly more apathetic orientation in the UK. So that in neither case is it a perfect balance. And you get the impression that Alma and Weber slightly prefer the British version of the balance than the American one. Anyway, what they find problematic is what they found in Germany, Italy, and Mexico, which was a variety of different ways in which the civic culture was not achieved. For instance, not to go through all of the examples, in Mexico, you have very high levels, quite high anyway, comparable to some extent with Britain and the United States, of pride in the political system and a sort of awareness of the possibility of influencing it, or claimed to have it, combined with very little effort to do so, which they called a kind of mythical version of the participant orientation, a kind of idealization of the Mexican revolutionary tradition is how they understood that, which they found to be not really what they thought was necessary for satisfactory participant orientations. Fell far short of that. So in a number of ways, these other countries fell short of the model of Britain and the United States. In the 1960s, this was a plausible thing to say. Italian, German democracy seemed relatively fragile. Mexican democracy had existed since the revolution, but still was a kind of one-party form of democracy. Problematic in a number of other ways. So you get this notion that you have a political culture that's suited to democracy. That's called the civic culture. And then from that, you get this notion of prerequisites of democracy, which is what the book was sort of known for having established. Now, this is more complicated than it seems because of the complexity of their picture of the civic culture. There's much more to it than what I just said. It's got a sort of degree of embeddedness in historical trajectories that is not normally mentioned. And it certainly distinguishes itself from positions that it was mixed up with by a lot of its critics, which they called psychocultural analysis, which attributes a society's culture to what happens to its population in their childhood and youth, which is what the famous critique by Brian Barry said about this book, that it was all, people were more likely to form their attitudes about politics from observing politics than from what happened in their childhood picnics. But they never said anything remotely suggesting the relevance of childhood picnics or anything in childhood. They were strongly against those kind of arguments, Alman and Weber. So these prerequisites were much more complicated than this idea of a childhood socialization theory. Nevertheless, the whole thrust of the book was to try and establish what it is that makes democracy survive, as it had in Britain and the United States in the mid-20th century, and be under serious threat in other countries. And from this, you get an extension of the idea to other countries that aren't democratic. I started in this field in Soviet studies, Sovietology, as it was called at the time. And my supervisor, Archie Brown, was one of the leaders of the deployment of political culture in that field, where the attempt was to show why some countries were more comfortable with communist regimes imposed upon them as they might have been than other countries were. And some countries, like Czechoslovakia notably, less comfortable, evidence seemed to suggest. Moreover, you get the deployment of political culture in a number of study contexts beyond Europe and the West, including rather problematic deployments like the theory of so-called Asian values, meant to justify the non-existence of democracy in Singapore, or the limited character of it, because of the presence of Asian values in this country. So even though Alman and Weber didn't fully license this kind of comparative usage of political culture where it turns into a variable. In fact, Alman later wrote that political culture wasn't a variable. It was a sort of package of things that could possibly be analysed as variables, but on its own it wasn't one. Nevertheless, it began to be used in that way. Second phase is the phase in which Ullmann and Weber started to look very passé, very unfashionable. Democracy seemed to be surviving and looking less fragile, to become more consolidated, and began to expand around the world, and expanded somewhat in its internal scope within countries as well. So it intensified. There was extensive and intensive consolidation of democracy, you might say, to use economic parlance. There was also a reaction to this extension in the form of a critique of new forms of participation and wider forms of participation that were becoming apparent in the 1970s, in the form of the thesis of overload. And this has often been associated in retrospect with Ullmann and Weber's book, because this seemed to suggest if there was more participation on a wider range of themes, as seemed to be happening in the 60s and 70s, that would appear to undo the balance that the civic culture represented, and you had instability. And so there was promulgated this well-known theory of participatory overload, the most notable expression of which is this report to the tripartite commission of Crozier, Huntington, and Watanuki, called The Crisis of Democracy. But as a counterpoint to that, there was a progressive and optimistic reading of what was going on, which ultimately came to prevail. And the crisis of democracy, just like the civic culture in retrospect, started to look passé, started to look like an unnecessary kind of conservative reflex to the expansion of democracy. And you get the emergence of various alternative progressive analyses of what I think could be called developmental democracy, a developmental theory of democracy. The democracy is not just a fixed state that you achieve as a kind of threshold condition, and then you might fall back over the other side of the threshold, as happened in Germany in the 30s. Rather, it's a process that continues to develop, it continues to change, it gets more democratic over time, and this needn't necessarily result in instability. But what it obviously does do is bring into doubt the idea of a fragile balance, which Ullmann and Weber had proposed. Now, this idea of developmental democracy is not new in the 1970s, though it got a significant revival in that period as a reaction against this conservative variant of the Ullmann and Weber thesis. In fact, I would place the origin of this position in the writings of Mill in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, in various of his writings on liberty as well, and contains some of this kind of argument, but mainly in Considerations on Representative Government. He says there, what I've quoted on screen, that just by process of education, people start to want to participate in government, start to want to have some kind of control, start to want autonomy as opposed to revert to sort of Kantian terms, heteronomy. This is a kind of modernization theory of democracy, essentially, that as education levels increase, demands for democracy will more or less naturally increase as well. And once you already have democracy, the intensity of it and the scope of it will also tend to increase. So this is the kind of basis of these more optimistic positions that were taken in the 1970s. But in terms of political culture, I'm going to focus in on two of them. And I think this is not an arbitrary choice of examples. These are very widely influential theories. And one of them is more easily identified with political culture than the other one, but both of them actually quite easily, despite that. The first one I'm going to talk about in this second phase of consolidation is a well-known theory of Ronald Inglehart and his various collaborators, a theory of post-materialism. Again, I imagine most people here have quite a bit of familiarity with this theory, so I won't spend my entire time expounding it. It's got a number of problems and difficulties, I would say, but it's been quite influential and appears was developed over many decades in many books written by Engelhardt and collaborators, not all of which I have to admit I've read, which says purport all to say the same thing, actually don't all say the same thing. There was an interesting study to be made of that process as well. Another thing I might try and write in the fullness of time. And I'm always saying what I might write. It is, in any case, a theory of values. And this is the main way in which you can identify it as a theory of political culture, apart from the fact that Engelhardt himself says it is. And a title like Culture Shift doesn't leave very much in doubt as to its alignment with the research program of Ullmann and Weber, which, as I say, Engelhardt has expressly aligned himself with. This is important, I think, this is a theory of values, because values is only one of the components of political culture as Ullmann and Weber defined it, and to my mind, not the most important one, for reasons I'll explain later on. But it's the absolute centerpiece, leitmotif of Engelhardt's theory. It's well known, I won't say too much about it. He is an advocate of the theory of early socialization, which Ullmann and Weber had somewhat criticized, although he doesn't emphasize childhood socialization so much as a formative period of adolescence and early adulthood in which one is open to the acquisition of values, supposedly, and then one gets less open to the acquisition of new ones later on in life. And so you have generations being formed depending on what the circumstances are in which they have this formative period. And the kind of circumstances he means are the conditions of political stability and economic security, which obtained in more and more countries, particularly in Western Europe, which he initially focused on, in the post-war period, such as Germany, became obviously quite economically prosperous fairly soon, and also politically quite stable fairly soon after the war, creating not just there, but in many other Western European countries as well, conditions for what he called formative security. And this would produce a change in values, where people would no longer struggle over distributive questions about who gets what, but be more interested in what he called post-material values. These would become a new topic in democracy. He was essentially looking at the politics of the 60s and 70s, noticing how many new things were entering into political debate, and finding an explanation for, and more importantly, perhaps at least more influentially, a label for these new things, post-material values, having to do, he said, at least in this book, with belonging, self-expression, and quality of life, or the quality of life. I say in this book because his account of what post-material values are, his summary of what they are, does actually change over his numerous substantial works that he did for the rest of his life. He only died a couple of years ago, as you know, with various collaborators. And other times he defined these things differently. And in fact, he even deviated sometimes from the term post-materialism. Sometimes he called them postmodern values, which is an interesting alignment of his work with what is methodologically quite a different literature. And in his most recent writings, he's called them, which confuses matters a bit, given that this is already an exercise in political culture analysis, he calls them cultural values. That can be extremely confusing and quite unnecessarily so, I would say. So there's a definite instability, not just in labels, but also in conceptualization. Nevertheless, there's some continuity as well in the kind of things he was getting at. That's an important theory. I'll come back to some problems with it a bit later on when I speak about the third phase. The next one I want to talk about is the theory of cognitive mobilization, also very influential, very important, also has a lot to do with Engelhardt, as a matter of fact, because although he didn't write about it under that heading very much, and focused, as I said, on different aspects of political culture, he did actually coin the term, as far as I can tell, cognitive mobilization, that was then adopted by a much more famous expositor of this idea, probably the leading one, which is Russell Dalton, who in numerous books and articles has written about it. And it's much closer than Engelhardt's theory is to the position of John Stuart Mill. that I already mentioned, and is much more familiar as a kind of modernization theory, even though Inglehart's definitely is a modernization theory as well. Unlike Inglehart's theory, which is a theory of values, this is a theory of knowledge. And if you want to distinguish knowledge from know-how in a kind of Michael Polanyi kind of way, which I think one should, knowing that and knowing how is the distinction sometimes made by writers like Polanyi. Know-how features as well in Dalton's, as well as Inglehart's initial formulation of this idea of cognitive mobilization. As I said, it harks back to Mill. Is just a quotation, the kind of thing he meant. There's going to be a spread of education in advanced industrial democracies and a so-called information explosion through the mass media, and the cost of political information has decreased. Because of this cognitive mobilization, more voters are able to deal with the complexities of politics and make their own political decisions. Now, there's some quite fundamental problems here, because cognitive mobilization, the expression, seems to suggest both these changes in the cultural environment and the effects of them simultaneously within the same label. So cognitive mobilization sounds like a phenomenon in the world, but it's also a theory of what's going on in the world. And it's a little bit easier than it should be to flip between those two ways of conceiving it, in my view, which has been a problem right from the get-go, including here in this very these phrases I'm talking about. Cognitive mobilization here seems to refer to just the cultural changes, but because of it, you get these outcomes, and the whole thing is called cognitive mobilization because people are getting mobilized. The term itself contains cause and effect within it. I think that's a problem for any concept, but it's particularly one here. I'll move on, though. As I said, it's a continuation of Mill's position, and it's also a bit less explicitly than is the case with Inglehart, but still very evidently, I think, a continuation of Ullman and Weber's conceptualization of political culture, because as you recall, as I said this at the outset, cognitive orientations was one of the things they spoke about. In fact, they also spoke about know-how specifically in terms of a concept they had of political style. Not a very well-developed concept in the book, but anyway, mainly to do with know-how, what I would personally prefer to describe as skills of democratic behavior. So Dalton and cognitive mobilization theory are very much within that initial framework. And these have been, I think it's obvious enough, very important research programs over the last several decades, starting in the 1970s, continuing through the subsequent decades as democracy expanded its geographical reach, particularly in the early 90s. These notions were very much embedded within all the political culture study, whether it went under that name or not, that sat alongside the discipline or subdiscipline of transitology, for example. It's fairly obvious that both of those were widely deployed, perhaps more widely in the case of Dalton's cognitive mobilization and Inglehart's and post-materialism, but I don't think it needs much argument to say these have been widely influential theories. So these are the theories, the political culture theories, main ones. I don't say there aren't some others I might also discuss, but probably not so conveniently within 45 minutes. These are theories dominant in the second phase. We're in now the third phase. I'm going to call it the crisis of democracy. There's plenty of argumentation about what constitutes a crisis and whether this is a crisis. And I don't particularly want to get into that. It's the kind of thing you can easily get into as a preamble of your talk, and then you find 20 minutes have gone. So I'm not going to do that. Let's just say there are some difficulties with the democracy and some concerns about democracy right now. And notably, not exclusively by any means, but notably from the point of view of political culture research in the countries that Ullman and Weber thought were the most secure cases, the UK and the US. I think more especially the US, but a number of people have written about these difficulties in the UK as well, under various headings. Populism is the most widely deployed one in democratic theory. Again, one could go on for hours about this. It's a problematic concept because of its close overlap with, etymologically and in other ways, with the concept of democracy itself. So as a way of thinking about it, is really a kind of bad form of democracy, populist democracy, people sometimes say. And it's not always been very clear how you establish the badness of it in relation to democracy. So, there is an argument for saying it's just democracy with a bit too much participation in it. So perhaps it's an evocation of the civic culture. I'll be getting back to that. Demagoguery is sometimes invoked as a criterion for as a way of describing these issues of Trump and Boris Johnson and Berlusconi, etc., etc. Demagogues throughout the world have created some problems for Bolsonaro, etc., problems for democracy. It's fairly well known. And the concept of democracy is demagoguery, and the demagogue is interesting because of the much more substantial connections one can then make back to classical political thought, for which this was particularly for Plato and followers of him. He was very skeptical about democracy, of course. It was because of demagoguery, the use of oratory by irresponsible leaders to mobilize large numbers of people. Then there's people who talk about neo-authoritarianism, neo-fascism, and so on. These, like populism and democracy, or fascism in particular, contain kind of democratic elements in the sense of mass participation of some kind, though obviously highly regimented. And you have the interesting concept, which came and went over a fairly brief period in 2016 and 17, but was quite a popular analytical term at the time, and has some merit in my view as an analysis, although I don't like the label for reasons I'll come back to a bit later. Conceptualization has never been made completely secure, in my view, even under post-truth, which was the only sort of new member of this conceptual family. So you might think it would be, easier to define it in a way that was going to be well attuned to the circumstances it was supposed to be describing. And indeed, I think it was that. It was well defined, but that's partially because it was a mainly descriptive concept, not so much an explanatory one. It makes some gestures towards explanation. I'll come back to them at the end, but I think a better explanation, the one I'm kind of promoting in this talk, is available. And it makes much more clear and explicit what's just implicit in these terms, the linkage with the concept of democracy itself, and also the linkage with political culture, as I'll make clear. Anyway, how was this third phase theorized? Well, post-materialism and cognitive mobilization theory are still going strong at the outset of this phase. Let's date that more or less the beginning of the middle of the last decade, approximately, say about 2016. I mean, that's a very Anglo-US centric way of understanding it, but this is a somewhat Anglo-US centric talk I'm giving. Because I'm somewhat Anglo myself is one reason, but the other reason is what I've said about Ullmann and Weber. So getting back to Inglehart's response is an interesting one, and this I have written something about. In fact, was the basis of my talk at the ECPR last year that some of you were at. His main response is his book, Cultural Backlash. It's got some theoretical problems, in my view, on top of the ones that already exist in the post-materialism theory, particularly this very concept of backlash itself. Cultural backlash is the phenomenon whereby people of conservative, as he calls them, cultural dispositions, suddenly become prominent in politics or get active in politics because they see that a lot of people of post-material cultural dispositions, pro-minority rights, pro-gay rights, pro-reproductive rights, pro-environment. A person sees that these are, conservative people see that these are becoming more prevalent, getting more and more influence in government, and there's a backlash to that. Backlash just means a cultural reaction to other people's culture. When it passes what he calls a tipping point, when a sufficient number of people have these modern or postmodern, in one of his formulations, ideas, post-material ideas, cultural ideas about belonging, self-expression, and quality of life. When there's a sufficient number of those in the population, you start to get the conservatives mobilizing, and you get this traditionalist, religious, authoritarian, he calls it in this book, backlash. Now, perhaps you do. That phenomenon could certainly occur. It's rather difficult to align it with his theory of how people acquire their culture, because he's not said anything before this book that people get their culture from looking at other people's culture and seeing how many of them there are. That's a kind of new mechanism that has to be invented for this book. And to my mind, it seriously compromises the existing mechanism. If he had, through his career, spoken more than he did do, which was hardly ever until recently, about right-wing post-materialism, instead of always assuming it was all environmentalism, green politics, gay and other minority rights, reproductive rights, all good stuff from a liberal point of view, he might have been on safer ground with his analysis of more recent events, but he never actually mentioned right-wing post-materialism. It was as if this was a new dimension of politics, but it only had one side, until recently, when this other side has popped up, thanks to the prevalence of the post-materialists, who gradually replace the materialists as the latter die off. And this produces some analytical incoherence as well as conceptual, because in this book, the baby boomers, the generation born between 1945 and 1964, in his initial account, in all of his early books on the subject, who he presented in those books as the vanguard of post-materialism, because they were brought up under conditions of formative security in Western Europe, in this book are the bad guys. They and the interwar generation, who are mostly dead by now, but have still some people hanging on and are quite conservative, according to him. The baby boomers, however, which include people like me, I was born in 1960, are now getting on a bit, but still quite prevalent in the electorate, and can exercise quite a bit of power if they choose to. And of course, older people do tend to vote more. So that's a generally well-established claim, coming under a bit of question lately, but still quite widely supported. He simply reassigned them. They've all gone, not all, they've gone proportionately more conservative than the younger generations. Who are now called, he uses these kind of journalistic titles, millennials and Gen Z, as they would be called in American parlance, Generation Z. These are the new post-materialists, but they're being opposed by these right-wing, more elderly post-materialists who've emerged into prominence very bizarrely, and they're the very same people whose liberal attitudes he thought were formed in the 60s and 70s and were never going to change. So there's incoherence there for sure. That's not my principal point, though. As I've said, you've got the emergence of right materialism, and what that produces for Inglehart is, or many other people have written about as well, this kind of cultural politics or cultural wars, which is very evident in the United States and quite evident in other countries as well, certainly in the UK, where Germany too, where the issue of immigration tends to be the vanguard of it. These phenomena are certainly happening. And even though culture wars are sometimes said to be, particularly by left-wing analysts, kind of made up sort of bread and circuses, well, circuses, distraction for the electorate to get them excited about something so they don't notice that massive economic inequality has been created in the United States in particular. I don't think it's entirely made up in the sense that there's a response to this attempt to distract people. And if there hadn't been something in the population to whom these kind of arguments would appeal, there wouldn't be any such thing. There would never be any response. In the US, anyway, there definitely is a response. So this is a phenomenon that's been happening, no doubt about it, and I'll say a bit more about it. But it's not particularly well explained in political cultural terms, at least according to the theory of Inglehart. What might we say about the other line of political cultural analysis, the focus on knowledge, that focuses on knowledge? Well, here's where the post-truth argument comes in. And here's a nice statement of the problem by Barack Obama, who said this in an interview with David Remnick in the New Yorker when he was in the lame duck period of his presidency after the election, which would produce President Trump in a couple of months after he got installed. This argument about climate change. There's now an issue of whether you can even establish the facts of climate change, whereas it used to be possible. People would believe the scientists and just debate about the means to do something about it. Now, this is an interesting statement. I think it's an oversimplification on his part, but it does still draw our attention to something that's definitely an issue. And it is beyond question, I think, even though the idea of post-truth came and went rather briefly around about this time, came and went, producing about 10 books, mind you. Wasn't just a flash in the pan, but didn't last as long as Allman and Weber have. It's quite obvious these problems have continued, and particularly, again, in the United States, where you have two quite unexpected phenomena, unexpected even by me, and that's of some significance to me anyway, because I'd already written a book that might have led one to expect these phenomena. I didn't have the courage of my own convictions. Namely, you have these extraordinary symptoms of vaccine denial and election denial. That is denial of established facts when you accept the establishment of facts by certain institutions that are warranted to do that, supposedly. In the case of vaccinations, again, by scientists, and vaccine denial is widespread in the United States, has produced a definite disparity in death rates among Republican supporters compared to Democratic ones, because they're much more likely to be supporters of vaccine skepticism and vaccine denial. And this is still going on now. And of course, election denial, which means distrust of another set of warranted fact finders, namely election officials and indeed the courts, to whom claims of irregularities were later on remanded, and who found uniformly, at least by the end of all these court processes, not all of the individual decisions on the route to the end, but by the end, that none of these claims were well-founded. None of that is believed by people, about 30% of the US population, who continue to think the last election was illegal or misconducted. So there's a crisis of knowledge for sure. What are we going to say about it? The post-truth literature says a bunch of stuff that's mainly descriptive. I'll come back to that shortly. I think we can get something from going back to Dalton, and Dalton himself takes us back to Allman and Weber. I might get something, get some theoretical purchase on this question. And I think this can be had, and this is what I wrote about in my book, Hyperdemocracy, from the theory of reflexive modernization. The theory that as modernization proceeds, it produces effects that tend to undermine some of its existing achievements. Reflexive, not in the sense of a reflex action, but in the sense of a self-affecting kind of action. Unfortunately, the word reflex has this rather problematic ambiguity. Now, as many people know, there's an important source for this in the work of Ulrich Beck, in his book Risk Society. And there was a lot of writing about reflexive modernization and reflexivity in general in the 1990s. Less so now, but I think it's an important concept. And that, for me, my favorite passage from this book is where he says this. I've quoted it in a number of things I've written. Demystification spreads to the demystifier. That's a reflexive component. and in so doing changes at conditions of demystification. And what he's talking about there is science. Science is a demystifier by virtue of a kind of secularizing effect that it has. He's talking about the standard Enlightenment picture and narrative of science replacing faith and myth. But as science progresses, its capacity to demystify becomes directed against itself. First of all, people find out more and more about how scientists are constantly arguing with each other, criticizing each other, falsifying each other, as Popper would say. As that gets more widely known, you get the idea of dissident scientists, maverick scientists, and people find out about them. This produces a demystification of the demystifiers, weakening them. Now, for Beck, this was all good. Beck, although he was more radical, and some people have classified him as a postmodernist, but he was certainly politically more radical than Dalton, who was an American liberal. But still, Beck was in the same direction. Beck read progressive implications from this, because I think he would have aligned himself probably with or does align himself. Forgive me, I didn't look up whether he was alive or dead. Aligned himself anyway with critical theory kind of positions, for which, of course, going back to Horkheimer and Adorno, the findings of science, and most especially social science, are really kind of potentially oppressive. So he thought that this demystification of science would be a progressive thing. So this is the same line as Dalton, but kind of more so. He called this phenomenon subpolitics. And in Risk Society and in his other writings, he thought this was a coming thing. And that was going to be a more participatory and localized kind of politics. It doesn't seem that that's what actually happened. What's happened is the phenomena I was talking about on the previous slide. There's a disablement of scientific authority and other kinds of cognitive authority as well, not producing widespread, beneficial political self-organization, but quite a bit of political self-organization, but not very beneficial. Chaotic effects, to the extent that one can talk of disbenefits on the level of one's own death, as resulting from these kind of self-organizing effects. Trust in maverick scientists, vaccine denial, trust in YouTube videos about what's going on in an election count, or videos rather, that get onto YouTube, about what goes on in an election counting office, rather than what the officials in charge say and what the courts subsequently reported. This is a more chaotic outcome, I think, than Beck anticipated. I don't think Beck correctly identified the consequences of his very insightful observations. That's what I tried to do under heading of hyperdemocracy. Now, this too has to do, therefore, with political culture research. What I've been trying to do is show through the history of political culture research how you get to an account of, but also a better understanding of, the so-called crisis of democracy. I think the crisis of democracy is a cognitive crisis fundamentally, not a crisis of values. So this is it gives some kind of suggestion about what components of political culture are most usefully studied if we want to understand this crisis. But Alma Weber already said this. It was not my idea to say this, nor was it Russell Dalton's. Alma Weber identified the cognitive dimension of political culture, or cognitive component of political culture, right at the start. And the cognitive dimension of democracy as a branch of democratic theory has been well known for a long time as well. Originally, it was spoken about favorably by Mill. That is to say, it had a beneficial relationship to democracy, as I explained. But of course, going back to the history of democratic thought, going back to Plato, which was essentially anti-democratic thought, Plato was all about how knowledge was going to be challenged and undermined by democracy. So you have an interesting connection there to elements of classical thought as well. These two components, these two cognitive aspects or components have a connection with each other and are the important elements of each of the things they are components or dimensions of. As I've said, this produces some degree of vindication of the civic culture, partially through the way it conceptualized political culture, but I think also because of the civic culture balance theory itself. Now, there is a danger that in speaking about chaos, as I have, and crisis, I'm just making the same mistake that Huntington made in the 1970s, who wrote the book called The Crisis of Democracy. So maybe this is just another conservative reflex of more participation and people who want to rely on experts and want to rely on existing authorities, cognitive authorities in general, not just scientific experts, but legal ones as well, and the media. This is just a conservative reaction. Well, it could be. I don't think it is, partially because it's on the conservative side of politics you are mainly viewing these phenomena of this radical populist mobilization and large numbers of distrusting people. They're not supporting left-wingers for the most part. There is supposedly such a thing as left-wing populism around. Some people say that Bernie Sanders and some prominent other people on the left represent this. I think it's a rather thin argument that is sort of other sidesing, really, an attempt to find a kind of analytical complement when there really isn't one. Anyway, that's not my principal theme. Whether or not this is a conservative position, there is at least better grounds than there was by the late 1970s for thinking it's still a live issue, whether there is a kind of destabilization possibility. And the principal claim of homina verba that got lost in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but we're now very much reminded of this idea of fragility that kind of disappeared from view, and people stopped talking about the Weimar Republic all the time. Well, they now started talking about it a little bit more in recent times. You hear it a lot in a lot of US commentary, despite there's a kind of taboo about mentioning it in some quarters. But this question of fragility has come back. It's a fragility on a different basis than homina verba thought. Interestingly, it's a basis that arises once you take the developmental potential of democracy into account, which is what I intended to do with the concept of hyperdemocracy. And it directs our attention to certain empirically researchable things. The most important one is persuasion. How do people come to have these beliefs that they apparently have? Beliefs become more important than values, I think, under this analysis. How does that work? There are people who study this. It's perhaps getting a bit easier to study now than historically has been because of the possibilities of big data. And there are some quite famous studies done using these methods. The problem with these methods is that the big data are all proprietary. You have to get, well, you might need the help of Elon Musk, which you might not find very likely to get if you want to study these kind of data. But I don't study this myself, and I can't make any strong recommendations about how to do it. It very much needs to be studied. I don't think the topic of persuasion has been anything like sufficiently analysed in the whole history of democratic political thought, to be honest, because I think, in fact, political thought generally, in fact, because politics only exists because of the possibility of persuasion. Otherwise, how do you explain how such a small number of people manage to control the behaviour of such a large number of people who could easily tear them to pieces at a moment's notice if they wanted to? There's a dynamics of persuasion that needs to be front and centre in all political analysis, and particularly in the analysis of current events. And there's also psychological mechanisms. Now, a lot more people are studying this kind of thing, or rather noticing that psychologists study it. So you find people writing about cognitive dissonance quite a bit. And a lot of the post-truth literature, to come back to that, did mention a lot of relevant psychological studies. Well, this on its own is not sufficient to explain what's going on, because people have always had psychologies and they've always had these psychological vulnerabilities, I think. We need to explain the social aspect of this and hence the political one, and the psychological mechanisms on their own can't explain it, but you're going to certainly need to pay attention to them. So that overlap with political psychology and psychology, social psychology in general, I think is a very important focus for political culture research, and a possible way to make use of the survey method. Skeptical about that, though I have been in the past. And it also directs our attention to the infrastructure of culture, the means by which culture gets produced, and that, of course, means the media, but various other institutional settings and centres. Now, from a theoretical point of view, this might point us towards some writings on cultural materialism, whose ancestry is in Marxism. I'm thinking of Raymond Williams particularly, but it also points us just towards not necessarily Marxian at all, studies of media and so on. Of course, I'm fully aware people do all that already. This is not a new emphasis or a new topic, but it's arguably an important emphasis in political culture research. The infrastructure of culture in the United States includes, for instance, legal provisions that make it very difficult to control the media or to regulate them, namely the way the Supreme Court's interpreted the First Amendment. This requires careful study as well, especially if one wants to do anything about it. And so you come back to the idea of post-truth, but post-truth books that came out in 2017, 2018, mainly focused on what I call exogenous threats to democracy from outside it, like Trump himself, Donald Trump himself, or social media themselves and the patterns of ownership. To my mind, one needs to focus on endogenous threats, I put the emphasis on the first, on the prefix. Those arise because of the reflexive capacity of democracy. They arise within the cognitive dimension of democracy, and they bring us right back to the position that I started with in this talk and the political culture researchers started with, Allman and Werber's conception of fragility. They had a conception of fragility that was created by their experience of the mid-20th century, and particularly the Third Reich and the Second World War. Our experience is nothing like that bad, and perhaps it won't be. But it's getting to the position where we start to worry about the fragility of democracy. And we don't go all the way back to Allman and Werber, but we go part of the way back by recognizing they had their eye on knowledge and know-how, and that's where we should have our focus as well. So I think this is not a new direction for political culture, quite an old political culture research, quite an old one, but one that present circumstances give us every reason to prioritize. Thank you very much.